So remember our discussion about the northern white women, the northern white suffragettes, had kicked black women to the curb to gain favor and support from the southern white women who wanted nothing to do with anything that included black women. Do you think that stopped the black suffragettes? The answer is no. It did not stop them. And the thing about it is, black suffragettes were looking at more than just gaining the right to vote. They were looking at other issues that were impacting black people at that time. And we will talk about the things that they did in addition to trying to obtain the right to vote, not just for themselves, but for everybody. We're going to start with my personal favorite, Sojourner Truth. Now, Sojourner Truth was actually born Isabella Baumfree. She was born in 1797. Now, she was born to, I believe it was, I know this, James and Elizabeth Baumfree. Now, James and Elizabeth was bought, including all their children. They were all bought by a Colonel Herdenberg. Yeah, Colonel Herdenberg bought the entire family and took them to his estate. And the thing about it is, when he died, his son took over and kept them enslaved. Now, what happens, what we are going to detail, is a series of being sold from one owner to another owner. I went to the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago. And they tell you when you get there, I think you had needed to start on the bottom floor and work your way up. And it tells you all about the transatlantic slave trade. It outlines the difference between slavery in the United States and slavery in all the other countries. And then you get to, I want to say it was the second floor. And on the wall, I don't know if it's still this way, but on the wall was essentially what we would call classifieds, where they listed black men and women for sale. And you know, I had held it together through the entire first floor. I had held it together through that second floor. And even reading the classifieds, I did not fall apart until I read an ad for a child. At the age of 9, Sojourner Truth was sold at auction with a flock of sheep for $100 to John Neely. John Neely was cruel and harsh and beat her daily. At one point, he had even beaten her with a bundle of rods. Neely sold her to a tavern owner for $105. This was in New York. The tavern owner only owned her for 18 months. He then turned around and sold her in 1810 to a John Dumont, also in New York. And John Dumont raped her repeatedly. And instead of standing up for all womanhood, instead of protecting her or shielding her or telling your husband to stop, his wife tormented Sojourner Truth. Instead of dealing with her husband, she took it out on Sojourner Truth. And if my numbers are correct, I think, or if my math is correct, I think Sojourner Truth was still a teenager. In 1799, the state of New York had started moving towards abolishing slavery. Now, it didn't come to an end in New York until I want to say it was 1827. Yeah, it was 1827 because Dumont had told Sojourner Truth that he would set her free a year before emancipation in New York. So when the time comes, he backs out of the deal, saying that her hand injury had slowed her down and she didn't produce like he expected her to. So taking matters into her own hand, in late 1826, she and her infant daughter, Sophia, escaped to freedom. Now, unfortunately, she did have to leave her other children behind, and she had, I want to say it was 5 to 7 children. So after she has escaped to freedom, she finds out that her son, Peter, was illegally sold to an owner in Alabama. She sued in court for her son's freedom, and she won. The first black woman to win in court against a white man. And she got her son free. So during the Civil War, Sojourner Truth actively recruited black troops to the Union Army. And she joined organizations that supported women's rights, ending slavery. What was it? Women's rights, abolitionists, religious tolerance, and pacifism. Those were the organizations that she joined during that time. So like in 1844, she had joined the Northern Hampton Association of Education and Industry in Massachusetts. And then in 1864, she was employed by the National Freedmen's Relief Association in Washington, D.C. And that's where you get your civil rights, because that's where she worked diligently to improve the conditions of African Americans. This is during the Civil War. And that last part, working diligently to improve the conditions for African Americans, that's work that she continued to do even after the end of the Civil War. Because in 1870, she worked on what most of you know as 40 acres and a mule. She tried to secure land and land grants for formerly enslaved black people, so that, I don't know, the little bit of reparations you promised us, can you actually give it to us? I'm asking for a friend. Unfortunately, that was not met with success, and she worked towards it for like 7 years. And the only reason, my own personal opinion, the only reason it was not successful was because of the changing presidents. Now, we are going to talk about 40 acres and a mule. But I do want to note that when the presidents changed, and it changed to Andrew Johnson, that's when 40 acres and a mule fell apart. We'll talk about that more. Okay. So throughout her life until her death, Sojourner Truth traveled. She gave speeches on behalf of civil rights and women's rights. She wrote books. So I went back and forth about adding this part in here or not. But in the context, I had to remember when this was. And the part that I questioned about whether I was going to add or not was the fact that she had met President Abraham Lincoln. And I hesitated because knowing what we know now, I'm like, But at the time, they probably didn't know that at the time. They just knew that he signed the proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation. There we go. He signed it and set them free. But fast forward to the future, we know that he said if there were any other way to end the Civil War, he would not have freed the slaves. But I added it in there because at the time, that would have been a big deal. Yeah. I just want to read like 2 quotes to demonstrate the impact that Sojourner Truth had then and has now. Because I believe that she is the blueprint for not just women's rights, but civil rights. I know others will say like some black man is. I disagree. I think it was Sojourner Truth. And the way she worked hard to get justice and equal rights for not just black women, not just women, but for everybody. So I'm going to read like 2 quotes to illustrate the impact that she's had. Now, this quote is from her biographer, Nell Urban Painter. And he had written, at a time when most Americans thought of slaves as male and women as white, Truth embodied a fact that still bears repeating. Among the blacks are women, and among the women, there are blacks. And y'all know what that is, right? You know what that sounds like. That sounds like intersectionality. And I'm going to go out on a limb, and if I have to sit there by myself, I will. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Sojourner Truth was the first intersectional feminist. Because she realized something that people don't understand today. You cannot expect black women, women of color, anybody with more than one identity to choose between their identities when they are impacted by oppression differently. You can't do that. And she called it out. Where there is women, there are blacks. Where there are blacks, there are women. In her eulogy, Frederick Douglass said, "Venerable for age, distinguished for insight into human nature, remarkable for independence and courageous self-assertion, devoted to the welfare of her race, she has been, for the last 40 years, an object of respect and admiration to social reformers everywhere." She was the blueprint.